Oui, ok. Bon, j'ai le très grand plaisir de vous présenter le panel de cet après-midi. Ça va se dérouler en anglais, mais posez vos questions en français et je vous aiderai. Merci beaucoup. So I have the pleasure of introducing the panel. If you want details on the biography of Fahima Hashim from Salmmah's Women Resource Group in the Sudan, or from Nidhi Bansal of Plan Canada, who's a senior gender equality advisor, you can find them in the sheet of paper that you got in here. But on my far left is Claudette Commanda, who is very much in demand. And so her bio somehow did not make it into the list. So I'm going to do a very brief edit so that you'll understand how lucky we are to have Claudette among us today. Claudette Commanda is an Algonquin Anishinaabe from Kitigan-Zibi and Nishinabeg, and I forgot to get your help to pronounce that, so please forgive me. First Nation located very close to us in the province of Quebec. She's a graduate of the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Common Law and Faculty of Arts, and she's dedicated the last 30 years to promoting First Nations people, history, culture, and rights in various capacities. Since 1999, she's a professor at the University of Ottawa's Institute of Women's Studies, Faculty of Education, Faculty of Law, and the Aboriginal Studies program. And in addition, because she doesn't have any time, she's the Executive Director of the First Nations Confederacy of Cultural Education Centers, a national organization mandated to protect and promote First Nation cultures. And there's more that I can add, but she's just been re-elected for a third term on the Kitigan-Zibi Band Council, and she's a mother of 4 and grandmother of 10. And so we're very lucky to have you on the panel with us today. So as an introduction to our theme, it's been 20 years since the Beijing Conference on Women in 1995 in Beijing, China. And where are we on human rights? And 20 years ago, I was in the preparations for the Canadian delegation to Beijing. And I want to tell you that the civil society meeting was held in Wairo. The government of China was nervous about CSO activity, and so they moved the NGO forum to about 40 kilometers outside the city limits of Beijing. And then they surrounded this huge encampment with signs that said, "Shopping is fun." Now, as you can imagine, at a conference in which there are 30,000 women talking about 12 areas of critical concern, ranging from sexual and reproductive health and rights, legal issues, girls' education, violence against women, women's role in peace, some shopping went on, but it was mainly shopping for ideas, shopping for resolutions, shopping for commitments from governments to make changes. When we moved into the Millennium Development Goals, not many people understand today that Millennium Development Goal number 3, which was gender equality and the empowerment of women, was intended to be a proxy for the world's commitment to the Beijing Platform for Action. So it wasn't just about one thing, girls' education. It was about the whole 12 areas of critical concern that we in Canada and all of the countries in the world, we had joined that consensus. So it was much broader than MDG 3. And now as we move into the Sustainable Development Goals, which we've heard a lot about over yesterday and today, gender equality is still there. It's now number 5. And instead of having 12 areas of critical concern, there are 9 sub-goals. We're still working on some of the issues that we were working on in 1995. But I'm hoping that it's a little bit like education. The first time round you do addition, the next time round you do multiplication with 1 digit, then your teacher makes you do it with 2 digits, and then all of a sudden you're in algebra and geometry. So I'm hoping that we're making some of these these changes. But there are a lot of challenges, and so now I'm going to challenge you, and some of you I'm going to choose you for later on. I'm going to ask you, this is like table talk for those of you who belong to Toastmasters. Be prepared. I'd like you to take just 5 minutes at your table to think about women's rights since 1995. What has been perhaps our biggest win on women's rights in the past 20 years? Or maybe you want to talk at your table about what is one of the main obstacles. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, talk among yourselves, and I'm going to come and just select among you and ask you to give me some examples, and we'll start the discussion from there. Thank you. For women's rights, and I see no hands go up. There have been wins for women's rights. Surely we can identify one.
We didn't have any stats at our table to back this up. And certainly this is not the case in Canada, but we thought perhaps women's political participation, there had been some gains over the past 20 years around the world.
Okay, women's political participation. Yes?
We acknowledged was maybe a small gain. The call in Vienna was women's rights as human rights, and at that time it was because women's rights were not widely understood and accepted within the broader human rights movement. But now, at least within the human rights, I think women's rights have been integrated, and so now we need to expand beyond that.
Thank you very much. Any other volunteers? Now I'm going to ask for obstacles that remain. And I see no hands going up. There are no obstacles left. Julia Bracken, you are near microphone number 3. Name me an obstacle. I'm being wicked.
We just laid bets that you would do this. An obstacle. There's been a deterioration and a backslide on support for women's voices and supporting particularly women's organizations and their role in civil society. And I think that this is a huge concern. I'm glad that in Canada Match is moving forward in supporting women's groups, but there needs to be a lot more of that. And it's a shame that in 20 years we're trying to almost start again to give space to women's organizations.
Thank you. Is anyone else? I could name you, so volunteer. Nina.
My name is Sana. I came from the Middle East. I think although all this last 20 years development on women issues, the last 2-3 years what we are witnessing is shameful to the international community. I'm not specifying any country or organization, but if we look what's happening in Boko Haram, how many girls were abducted and abused and married by force, or what's happening in Iraq or Syria. I think this is shameful. I haven't heard that big advocacy about what's happening. There are tiny things or some things that took a big fuss of advocacy for women's rights. And what's happening is really like ignored, not raised upon, nobody is talking about it as if it is completely an internal issue, which is not an internal issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have one person here at the microphone, and then we'll go on to our panelists. But we'll come back later. There'll be lots of time for questions. Yes.
Okay. So just supporting what the last person just said, gender-based violence. There's a lot of talk, but very little action on gender-based violence. And then talking about slide back as well is the backlash against gender mainstreaming. A lot of lip service, but again, very few results. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, I think in 5 minutes people can lay things out very clearly. Progress, but also continued challenges, and some progress that was made and maybe we've gone backsliding. So I'm going to ask our panelists to comment on this, and I'm going to start with Fahima.
Thank you very much. I think what has come from the audience has been actually one of the big wins and the big losses too. Yet, I think the increase of militarism and conflict and women facing war and conflict has not been a big issue that had been a setback. And that I'm talking about not only where I come from, but I'm also talking about conflict in different places, like she mentioned in Syria, and then rise of fundamentalism, Muslim and Christian and other fundamentalism that really impacted highly on restrictions and setbacks on women's rights. So these are two major things that I think has been very serious issues at the moment. And for us to look at them, I mean, we still need to start again to look at these things. So violence against women has been an issue on the table, of course. And voices of women, women's rights defenders, women organizing. This has been a lot of talk about violence against women that really made the violence against women an issue that people take forward and make it a serious commitment to government, to women groups, to the international community, to the regional commitments. And that, again, has its own problems with the lack of the political will of governments who always have a lot of big lip service of, yes, we are going to integrate this within our legal system, we are going to domestify these conventions and rights, but that remains. It's setbacks, and there's always have priorities to bring up and say, okay, we'll come back to these issues again. So there are so many challenges, I think, still facing us, women's rights defenders, women's, even at the level of research, at the level of this increase of a lot of studies and work on women's rights, on women's voices, women in peace. Still funding remain problematic, not only on research, but also on women organizations. And this is one of the I mean, I mentioned a lot of challenges and winning things that women's movement have done globally.
Nidhi.
So I definitely agree with Fahima on the issue of violence against women. Since Beijing, violence against women became an issue to be talked about in public, to be accepted. It broke the realms of private affair and came into the public discourse. We could not do much about it, definitely in terms of actually taking the steps to route it out, to look at the root causes of violence against women, look at the systemic nature of violence against women. That still remains to be done. But it has come out in open, which is the first step, that personal became political. Another big achievement which I feel is a lot of laws and policies, legal framework, institutional framework got set up in many, many, many countries. We're still not there. There are loopholes in those frameworks, but a lot of that got established since Beijing. As we move to the MDGs, there have been some gains in some of the practical needs areas, like education, primary education of girls, has been one of the areas where we've seen some gains, and in maternal newborn child health, as well as political participation, thanks to the the funding available through the MDG framework. But one of the biggest challenges still that remains is looking at the root causes, as I said earlier, and looking at the systemic nature, looking at the multiple systems that come together to create this system of oppression, marginalization, which includes the economic system, the social sphere where a woman or a girl actually experiences violence or discrimination or inequality, as well as the political system which lacks the will to challenge the traditions and customs in any setup. So those are big challenges still that we need to face.
Okay. Hello. Welcome, everyone here, visitors to Algonquin territory. I'm very honored to be here to share my experiences as a First Nation woman living under the colonial construct of the Indian Act and its implications, its colonial implications and consequences, and how it has detrimentally impacted First Nations people, in particular our women. The question I was asked is, what is the biggest win from Beijing? And I hate to be the bearer of bad news or sound not optimistic. But again, I'm telling you this based on the experience of the work that I have done with First Nations people, with women, and in particular living under the colonial construct of the Indian agent and all the tenets and the principles of the Indian Act. Has there been any wins? No, there hasn't been any with respect to First Nations women. What I can say is that locally we have mobilized from a grassroots level. The women have taken back their voice, they've taken back their traditional role as the caretakers, as the voice of our nations. But we had to do that locally because we couldn't do it through government support, nor could we do it through any organization or even through society. We had to do that, and we did it. What are the biggest obstacles? Well, I can say there are many. There's still that colonial legacy that remains, and it's those laws, the Indian Act. The Indian Act that was first created in 1755, that was imposed on my people throughout what is called Canada. That Indian Act that was imposed on the 633 First Nations that are here in this country, that comprises close to 800,000 status Indians, that's found in the 2,755 reserves that Canada created through its colonial laws, to dispossess the people from their traditional territories and their freedoms, to destroy our spirituality and our cultural practices, but most importantly, and how it took away the rights of our women, how it silenced the voice of our women. That Indian Act was one of the most detrimental violence against our women. And this Indian Act, ladies and gentlemen, is still here today. In 1868, the federal government created a provision called Section 12(1)B under the Indian Act that stated that any Indian woman who married out, whether she married a non-Indian or even when she married an American Indian man because he was not status, she lost her right to be recognized as who she is, an Indian woman or a First Nation woman. She and her children had no rights to be who they are. And on the contrary to that, the Indian Act stated that any Indian man who married any non-Indian woman, that woman became an Indian and so did her children. That is cultural genocide, that is genocide, that is racism. And it continues to this day against our women. The Indian Act also displaced our women to their right to land and to the natural resources. Another obstacle is the non-recognition of our inherent rights, our constitutional rights, and our treaty rights. Our rights have not been honored by the government. We have to take this to the courts. Lately, I can say that the court has been in favor of First Nation rights. The denial of violence against our women and our children, that is a big obstacle. And it is a reality that continues to this day. We need to look at the situation of murdered and missing Indigenous women. That is violence. And the numbers are increasing on a daily basis. The child welfare system that has taken away our children. 30,000 Indian children across Canada are in state care. In the province of Manitoba, 10,000 children. That is violence against our children. The lack of political will by government, whether it's provincial or federal, the lack of the political will to support that there is a need for a national inquiry, the denial of our rights, or even the fact that denying that any violence does occur. And what is the root cause? It is racism. Whether people want to accept that or not, that's fine. But we live it. We live it on a daily basis. In my home community, there are 2 young girls that have been missing since 2008. It has hit home. These are realities that we live with every day. When we see our women that have no rights to their land, to their voice, how we have been displaced, our clan systems have been broken, our names have been changed, and by the way, my name may be Claudette Commanda in the English terms, but I am recognized as 0073092002. That is how I am recognized under this Canadian law. That means I am a ward of the Crown. I am not Anishinaabe Kwe. I am a ward of the Crown because this Indian Act continues to dominate us. We have no rights to our ancestral land. We don't even have rights to reserve lands, because the Minister of Indian Affairs, who holds in trust those reserve lands, he controls. So there are many obstacles that are before us. These are realities. And I can honestly say that it has become worse in the last few years with respect to the rights of our women and children. Otherwise, we would not have 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women on a roster, and I believe there are more. And each and every day you pick up a newspaper, or you turn on the radio, or you watch a newscast, and they are reporting another woman that's gone missing. They are reporting another girl that has gone missing. They are finding human remains of our women and our girls. And now another reality that is out there is that even our boys now are becoming a statistic of a missing young boy or a missing Indian man. So the killings of our people have to stop. Racism must not be denied. And we need to find solutions, but solutions that are going to be based on that mutual understanding. But before we can even come to any solutions, you have to accept the realities that racism is a well-known factor that contributes to the many obstacles or challenges that First Nations people are dealing with. And we're not dealing with this in the last 5 years or 10 years. I can honestly say since 1492, because the imposition of colonial ways have been here since that time, and they continue. And we live it. Any one of us First Nations women that are here, we can attest to that. But I always have to be optimistic and say that there are good people out there, and we kind of have to make change. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudette. I think one of the powerful things about the Sustainable Development Goals is that Canada will need to step up and lay out goals for itself domestically, as well as goals that it will contribute to as part of its international responsibility. So when we're looking at what needs to be done on gender equality and the empowerment of women, we need to look at what does Canada need to do domestically, and we've heard very clearly from Claudette, but also earlier today from Kate McInturve, from Leilani Farhi, on what are some of the gender equality gaps that we have domestically. And then we also have to have goals for ourselves that are do no harm goals. So we may have a government that chooses not to fund sexual and reproductive health and rights, but it should not be blocking and doing harm to women by not permitting them access, even if they can't get it with Canadian funding. And then the third set is our international responsibility goals. What do we need to do internationally to address some of the gaps that have been talked about, that Fahima has mentioned, but I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you'd like to see done in your own context and in the Sudan and in Africa. So, thank you.
Thank you. I think after hearing this, I feel like sometimes that you look at colonialism and how does that also impact on women is a big issue that we haven't resolved, like patriarchy, that still remain an issue that we need to unfold and unfold continuously. In our context, one of the things that I think is major, that Sudanese women's movement used to cherish quite a bit of laws, that women had been enjoying them. I'm talking about 1970s and 80s. All these setbacks are not after Beijing, just before Beijing. And then the government took responsibility to really agree on the 12th agenda of the platform of action and sign on it and took really big responsibility to do it. Nothing has been done. I mean, when I say political participation, I think that was also a struggle by the civil society organizations, that women fought to get the 25% quota, which we won in 2008, which went and really cherished in the 2010 election, where we saw even over 32% of women who stood up and ran the election of 2010. And unfortunately, again, that was a setback because the government I think the government was also pushing not to allow the political parties to run elections, so the withdrawal happened just like I think a month before the real elections. So all this became again a big disappointment. So despite the fact that we have women in that level who could contribute to the executive management of our country, yet there is a big problem to handle that, because still patriarchy, fundamentalism, that are the two major things that the government says women should stay home. So I'm talking about 2008. This statement came from our government that women should stay back home, and this is the best place for them. So you can imagine the burden that fall into the women's civil society organization to create spaces for women, public space, that women can come and continue putting their voice forward. So the political will, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the major obstacles that actually took what we have enjoyed even before, which was also done through a big struggle of over 20 years with women fighting for cultural, social, economic rights for women. In 1965, Sudanese women were having equal pay for equal work. Today, that's not existing. We had the right to vote. Now, that is actually might be hindered because because of patriarchy, and maybe the men of the family may say you don't need to go out and give your voice. You know, and that could stop some from going. Education for girls in many places, I'm talking about conflict area, boys and girls, now we have 2 generations that have been missing from primary schooling. I mean, they are now in their 14s and 18s. What are we going to do to look at them as young people who would be, you know, integrated within and living a normal life? So militarism is also another issue. A lack of international interest of looking at Sudan. Canada is not, for example, not interested in looking at Sudan and the women's rights situation. We used to have a lot of recognition, but that has also been reduced back, including funding. Because of the embargo, the US cannot, any civil society in the US cannot contribute to put any money to improving or promoting women's rights organizations in Sudan. Some of the European also have been withdrawing, especially after 2011 of the separation of South Sudan. I'm just talking, assuming that you people are a little bit aware of that, this secession between North and South that happened in 2011, that created actually quite a big problem. Not only economically, but also created a difference in the history. You know, Sudan, it's a country that I'm talking about. It's a country that was born in 2011. Not the country that fought for its independence for years from the British colonization and won its independence in 1956. You have to really learn, even what the lands we have. We used to know it by heart. Now I don't know really how much land we have. I don't know how big and what is the size of my country today. So these are all things that, you know, this, when you lose the heritage, what you've learned, it makes you feel a little bit that you really need to unfold and restart so many things again. So the lack of international recognition, the lack of political will, the push of discriminative laws, in the legal system, if, for example, women have been put into a forced hijab, for example, in the north part of Sudan, well, the Sudan of today. So if I don't wear hijab according to the definition of a Sharia dress, I get lashed in public 40 lashes, which is not part of the culture that I grew and I was brought up in. So these are all new things coming up. We need to really even learn, strategize, and learn how to work on these kind of things. So the wins and the gains that we got still needs to be re-looked at. And with lack of funding and lack of support, the government is controlling, of course, all the UN agencies. Now we have UN Women, we have UNDP, we have UNFPA, but like my organization, getting money of any UN agencies, the government screens that. My money can go back to the same UN agency because the government doesn't like it. So that control, that is not only on our, even if we get fund, sometimes reaching out to it and having it and using it might be problematic. So these are, and even more on that, regarding, for example, crimes in war situation, impunity is the huge thing. There's no one that can be, I mean, policemen, people with the security, people with the government, even the peace missions, they go with any crime they do. There is no law that really, actually they are protected by the law. And our legal system still doesn't really, because lack of awareness. You see, in the Beijing Platform of Action, legal awareness was one of the pillars of the violence against women agenda. A lot of gains, yes, a lot of people now are aware because of the role of civil society, of putting this into the front page. Even using media. Social media has become really, really one of the major things because you are restricted of many things, so you can use the internet. Even if you are in a locked room, you can always have your voice out using the social media. So all this has been, even with that, the government will not allow civil society to work in conflict zone areas. That is local organization. International organization will have a lot of restrictions. So there are so many obstacles that we're facing. And these, I mean, I think it's just a long way to go. It's not, I'm not saying it's setbacks, it's actually a country by country we are facing. At the regional level, we are also facing a lot of obstacles. So the international organization, the community is not also like, we're not signing CEDAW, we have signed the African Protocol for the People's Rights for Women and Children and Women and Girls, yet we haven't ratified it. So there are 36 countries in Africa, and out of 54 have ratified it. Sudan is not yet taken, and no one is measuring that. So I just say finally that still this is not the end of it. We have to be optimistic and carry on our roles to really make the change that we are dreaming of. Thank you.
After two very powerful, grounded in grim realities, maybe what I would like to say is what both Claudette and Fahima have been mentioning are grim violations of women's rights that look at you in your face and you cannot deny that those are violations of women's rights. But then let's not forget that in countries like Canada or where I come from in India, where there has been some progress, and visibly it might look as if women's rights have been achieved, there is a very long way to go. There are hidden issues that still need to be uncovered and still need to be addressed. And one of the things that any advocate that works on women's violence against women would testify is the links between the everyday discrimination and everyday lived experiences of women to these grim violations. The links between, somebody mentioned Boko Haram kidnapping, the link between denying women any agency and any right over their body and this Boko Haram kidnapping, to make that link and not become complacent when we have achieved a few gains, and recognizing that those links still have to be made, and still, unless you are able to root out the very, very basic, the roots of inequality, it will come back. The resurgence of fundamentalism of different kinds, be it economic fundamentalism or religious fundamentalism, will again erode all the gains. And therefore, an action plan that I would like to see should definitely be looking at moving beyond the legal frameworks to actually taking responsibility for even private actions, the state taking responsibility for private actions of violation of women's rights. An action plan that moves beyond looking at gains in, say, education or primary, those are important. I'm not at all saying that gains in education and health, women's health, and political representation are not important. Those are important, but looking beyond that and saying, not only looking at women as an object of development, as in so many women have now have access to maternal health, but looking at sexual and reproductive rights over their body, rights to determine what they would want to do with their body or not. So an action plan that is much more broader than just looking at immediate gains, and makes a commitment to bring together all the resources and address systemic issues across economic, social, and political spheres.
I must confess, I forgot the question. No, actually, what I just want to echo what my colleagues here have stated, and what I can say is in 4 words, what's needed is public awareness and that education awareness relating to the issues that I'm speaking about, those realities, and as well as the successes that First Nations women have gained as well. And I go back to stating that we mobilize at a grassroots level, and we have taken control of our voice, and we're instituting or reclaiming and recovering and restoring those traditional ways based on our spiritual beliefs and our cultural practices, restoring our ancestral traditional knowledge, because that is the only elements that will heal us from the colonial past and how we can move forward. But at the same time, Canadians, and as well as the international world, have to be involved with this as well. And one way to do so is acknowledging the colonial past, and also acknowledging that First Peoples here, whether we're in Canada or United States, and I will use the word North American Indians or First Nations, that we certainly had a history since time immemorial with very sophisticated cultures and governance, well intact and practiced before contact in 1492.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm hearing a lot of intersection between what happens domestically and what happens internationally. And the intersection, some of the issues are access to land, having the voice recognized, mobilizing at the grassroots, and once you've started mobilizing, being able to stay mobilized and not being pushed back inside the locked room, even if you have to use social media. And what you have to know is that Fahima and I had an earlier discussion about tweeting, as our colleagues over here were tweeting, and I said that in my view, some people under 30 were digital natives, but I felt like an immigrant who just put my first foot on the shore, because I'm definitely not a tweeter. So there's some issues there. The intersection of race and caste and class. And yet we see that when there's awareness, when you can name colonialism, when you can name violence against women, when you can name the dangers of impunity, that you're in the first step on a road that may be a very long road, but to making changes. So I'm going to open for questions and comments from the floor, and we have the 3 microphones. And in the meantime, while people are gathering their thoughts, does anybody want to say anything there? Yes.
Hi. I'm not sure whether this is a question or comment, but I'll just go right on with it. I would like to mention the marketing of women's bodies as an obstacle, whether that be hard or soft pornography, whether that be the slave trade, whether it be the business of cosmetic products and cosmetic surgery, and the extra pressures that that puts on all women from the time that they're this high. There have been gains made by women through the years, I do agree with that, in terms of cracking the glass ceiling, but when you're trying to do this while you have the extra work of raising a family, working full-time, keeping the house going, and now having to look like a movie star, it's very difficult. Janice Kovenak, KIDAP.
Thank you, Janice. Take another comment here.
Thank you very much. My name is Eileen Alma, and I'm from the Coady Institute, and I head up the International Center for Women's Leadership there. And I have a great honor, actually, of being able to work with women globally as well as across Canada, and in particular right now, we have a program with Indigenous women leaders, and it's quite exciting to be with them and address all those issues that have been raised today. Thank you for that. If we look around the room right now, and particularly the men and women, and as I'll speak maybe especially to the men, I can pretty much bet that most, if not all, of the men that are in the room are champions in some way or another of women's rights and of women's agency. And that's really heartening, and I'm really glad to see the numbers that we have present for this panel. My question is for you, and it's a question that participants, students that we have at Coady would ask me, is about how we continue to speak to those that are not the believers, especially the men, but not only the men, actually many of the women. And that is because they are either afraid or they have a fear of what agency might fully look like for women. It could be a whole myriad of things. They often hide behind tradition. In some cases, tradition is good. In other cases, it's not good. But we are talking to the same people who speak a similar language when we talk about rights, women's rights in particular. So what kinds of narratives do you suggest that we open up, especially when we have such a slide backwards when we talk about words like feminism and agency and empowerment? What are some of the things that you think we need to be doing collectively as men and women to bring other voices to our side on this? Thank you.
Well, let's start with that.
Great question, and I think each one of us would have struggled with that at some point. Anyone who has worked on women's rights would struggle with talking to the same people again, talking to the converted, as we say, and then maybe distancing the other people further and further away as you start getting together and your ideas consolidate and become so strong that people see your ideas radically different from what they think their ideas are, ideas of women's rights are. With Plan, we take, and I'm now bringing it down from a rhetorical question to, in reality, when we do programming in Plan, what we do. We have a very thought out strategy of engaging men. Engaging men as supporters for women's rights, but also engaging men in their own right. So when we are talking about a gender equality discourse, for example, in a health program, we definitely understand that men have the power, men make the decisions about women's health choices. While we work with women on enhancing their agency to make those decisions, we still need to, while that agency is being built and they are going to exercise those agencies, those women still need those health services. And men are the ones who make those decisions about those accessing those health services. So it is critical that we engage them to, as the gatekeepers for these women, we engage them. And the discourse, it is also not right to say that all men do not want women's rights. Men are also human beings. They also, you cannot just compartmentalize any human being as good or bad. They also differ everybody has an entry point for discussion. What's important is to find the entry point. And many a times the entry point is instrumentalist approach, like you are the one who makes the decision, so let's talk to you. But that has the risk, and I completely understand the risk of reinforcing the power of the men. And therefore, once you get them engaged, it is critical that you move the discussion on to what the gender division of roles and gender expectations mean for men as well as women. So what is the construct of masculinity and how that construct of masculinity is harming them also. So getting men engaged maybe through an area of interest which might be about the health of his wife and his ability to make a decision and his power to make a decision, but then moving it beyond that to how gender stereotypes and gender norms impact him as a man, and therefore also impact the woman that live with him. In the meantime, also working with women to enhance their agency so that all of this work starts coming together at a point where there is recognition that change can happen and change is not such a bad thing. Because if change is happening, it's only making life better and all the women are not becoming this rebel women who are running away with the assets. Because one of the things, funnily, which we hear is if the women will get power, they will run away with the land that they will get. And that's, you as a person, like, how are they going to run away with the land that they get? So looking at these fears and understanding that those fears are sometimes real, sometimes they are just made up to hide behind something. But keeping on engaging, finding the entry points with individuals, with groups, with younger men particularly, and taking the discourse beyond just reinforcing their power is one of the strategies that we have found to work.
Claudette, do you have something? Okay, thank you. That is a good question that you asked. What I do, and trust me, I've come across many of those in my line of work, whether it's in a classroom or in different forums. What I tend to do is, especially in a classroom, is I bring in to the students the lived and lived realities of First Nations people. And an example I can share with you is, in any of my courses that I teach, there is always a segment on Indian residential schools, because Indian residential schools, again, was another colonial legal policy that was imposed on our people, and the children were the target. And primarily, for those of you that don't know residential school or the objective of it, it was to turn our First Nations people into white people, and it was to totally annihilate our spiritual belief and our cultural ways and our practice and our identity. So what I do with I bring in residential school survivors. The survivors now are adults. Whether they're 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90-year-old survivors, they are adults. So when students are first learning about the survivors or residential schools, they automatically assume that these are all old people and this happened hundreds of years ago. When I bring in a survivor or survivors, I also bring in children into the classroom. I ask the survivors to bring in their children or their grandchildren. And that really hits home the reality. It puts into perspective into the mind of the students. They get to see firsthand that residential schools impacted children. Because I always say to them, it happened to children. These survivors are adults today, but they are children. So I find what's successful is when students, they actually see and feel and hear from firsthand people experience. I also want to add what my colleague here had spoke about men's rights, and it's so true that our men, they have rights as well, and they have been displaced from their rights. And I can again speak from experience as a First Nation woman and seeing how colonialism has deeply impacted not only our women but our men as well. Because through colonial law and policy, it removed our women from their traditional role as the caretakers of the land. Our men were the hunters and gatherers and the protectors. The women were the caretakers of the land. Basically, we were owners of the land. We had that voice. So colonial law, with its European religious beliefs, removed our women as caretakers of the land, and they also removed our men from their freedoms to be hunters and gatherers and protectors. So our women had nothing. What did our men have? Well, they replaced our matriarchal ways with the patriarchal, meaning now our men, they became the farmers. They became the caretakers of the land. They became the gatherers of food because they could no longer go out and hunt and to practice hunting and fishing. They no longer had the freedoms to their traditional role. So our men were impacted by colonialism. So here we are today having to deal with the loss of those traditional roles, whereby we even have to teach our men what their ancestral traditional role and teachings were in their societies and in their nations. Yes, there are some that object to this or don't believe it, including our women. Some of our own women do not believe that we operated in matriarchal societies or matrilineal or matrilocal, or that we operated in clan systems, or that we had voice. But this is what colonialism has created. I like the words of Patricia Montour, a legal scholar, a Mohawk legal scholar, when she says, the consequence of colonialism is dysfunctionalism. When you're living dysfunctionalism for generations, it becomes so normal. And then eventually it becomes internalized colonialism. And that's what we have to break in our communities. We have to educate our women of their ancestral traditional role, inherent role, and we have to educate our men of their own traditional ancestral role. And we find that through our cultural practices based on our spirituality, not religion. Not religion. Because religion was imposed here in 1492. But we've always had our spirituality, our ceremonies, our laws, which are found in our ceremonies and found in our languages. And by restoring, first of all, reclaiming, restoring our traditional ways, our languages and our laws, that is how we bring back those fundamental ancestral traditional roles and ways of our people. And again, bringing culture and ceremony into the classroom or into a forum, I find is very helpful, and it helps to It helps to make a believer out of a non-believer.
Well, just to add one point, that social transformation, I believe, needs both men and women to work together. And in that, I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical to work with men my age, but I think working with young men and children, it will make maybe the transformation, at least for the future, much more. At least education can add into that. They can have a different thinking of looking at men and at women and working with them and integrate in themselves into programs working on masculinity and violence against women and other things.
Thank you. I started out as a primary school teacher, and in grade 3, I didn't work on changing kids' attitudes. I worked on changing their behavior. So if you're starting with grade 3, you start with behavior, and maybe attitudes will follow. But I think that that's the non-believers you may always have with you in any situation. There will be people who don't believe in climate change, and there will be people who don't believe in vegetarianism. But what you can say is, here your behavior is, at this vegan meeting, you will not roast a steak in front of everybody. You know, you're looking at behavior, you may not change the attitude. And I think, so that's one of the points that I've worked on. I'm going to take one more round of comments and questions. Or some comments on anybody that I taught in grade 3 who says my attitude has not changed. I think one of the, then I'll comment while people are thinking about going to the mic. I think one of the most interesting Canadian models that's been out there is the White Ribbon Voices. The men that organized around Jack Layton at the first anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, and said, men have to stand up and do something about violence against women. And their focus is on talking to young men and saying, don't be that man. And that's become a model around the world, where we funded projects with the White Ribbon Campaign in Brazil and in other countries. And I think the current head of the White Ribbon Campaign is on the Advisory Council of the Secretary General on the issue of violence against women. So there are things that we are learning and that we can model. And I pass the microphone to the lady at number 2.
I'm the lady who did the opening this morning. I'm from Kiragan-Zibi, and I'm Claudette's support. I work at Binwashin Lodge here in Ottawa, and it's an Aboriginal Women's Support Center. But prior to that, I worked at this National Aboriginal Circle Against Family Violence, which was dealing with the shelters and transition houses, but the mandate was also violence against women. And that was my first step in a foray of more of a social context. And when exploring this whole issue of violence, there was a different understanding to that of mainstream when it came to Aboriginal women. But I always remember, just as when I started, I attended this conference with the elders. And one of the comments that always rang true with me is that especially the Inuit women in the north said, as we're providing services for women and children escaping violence, whether it be the shelter and support, what are we doing to the men to heal them as abusers? And again, too, as well, it's that understanding that, from our understanding, is that the male-female balance each other. And our understanding is to bring in the next generation. And a lot of times, too, with the violence, the women want just the violence to end. The other comment that the elders mentioned too as well is, with the justice system, when we throw the men in jail, they come out, they learn new skills, and they come out more angry. So is there alternative ways that we need to explore to address also this violence, and in terms of also this whole concept of healing? And again, we were fortunate to as well this past year to host with Claudette a group of judges, and again too as well, they wanted to explore this whole concept of restorative justice. And again too, how do we balance that need for healing, but at the same time, there's some pretty bad abusers out there. But again too, it's opening up that conversation and relearning, because we had our own justice system as well here prior to contact. So on that note, I say, miigwech.
Yes. Thank you very much to all the panelists. That's, I think at the end of the day, there's a real challenge. People have been listening and talking all day, and you've managed to bring new insights and new energy and new urgency to this important topic. And my question is, how do we talk about women's rights, gender equality, when we're also talking about other issues? Yesterday in the consultation on the new Sustainable Development Goals, a panelist said, oh, well, you know, we mention women in about 6 of the goals, and I think that's pretty good. And someone at my table remarked sarcastically, yeah, for half the population, we get 6 out of the 17 goals. And so I'm just wondering what advice you have that when we're talking about all the other really fundamental issues that we have to deal with, inequality, the environment, fair taxation, how do we also make sure that women don't become just a special interest group and relegated to, well, we're going to talk about all these things and then we're going to talk about women? Thank you.
So, to your question, somebody once said to me in a program, similar circumstances, where we were talking about the programming, and they said, yeah, but we will talk about women later. What do women have got to do with this? And I did not have to answer, and somebody else answered before me saying, well, does it have to do anything with people? If it has anything to do with people, half of those people are women. And half of those people are impacted by the gender norms differently. So just look for that difference, how they are, say you are talking about environment or taxation. And the panel before that, this one, we talked a lot about how taxation can impact women differently. How not collecting that money through the taxes puts a strain on the social services, and how, because women have the gender division of labor, puts women in a place where domestic responsibilities fall mostly on women. Then what follows is that women have to stay behind from their jobs and take care of the elderly, take care of the sick, and take care of the children and all the household work. And therefore taxation, while it might look like a very corporate issue, is very intrinsically linked with women's experiences. So I would say look for, within that issue, if it deals with people, how it impacts women differently, and therefore women should be in each of the 17 goals and not just mentioned in 6 of those.
And I would add to that in all my experience, I spent over 30 years at CEDA, and I said the same thing. You don't need to do a gender analysis if there are no people in your project. If, however, there are any human beings, I want to see a gender analysis. And in those 30 years that I was at CEDA, there was only one project that I conceived of as not really needing a gender analysis. And that was when, out of not our official development assistance program, after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, Canada contributed to putting the cement sarcophagus on top of Chernobyl. I did not think they needed to wait for a gender analysis. We're all downwind, right? But that's the only project. And I think if you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see that none of them are gender neutral. So that's something that we need to hold our government to the fire and our partner organizations to the fire on that, whether we're working on domestic issues of colonialism and patriarchy or international issues of gender inequality and abuse of human rights.
I think that's going to have to be the last word. These people are getting hungry. On behalf of CCIC and CIDAP, I want to thank all of you women for giving us very different perspectives on where we've come in the last 20 years. And I'm sure that it's been illuminating for me, delightful to meet all of you as speakers, and hope to hear from you all soon.
Merci bien.